Hi again, everybody. I'm Saoirse O'Brien, and this is the Kitchen Powered National Parallels online symposium. And this is the fourth session, which is about Spain and about Canada. So I'm going to hand over now to the chair for this afternoon. Well, it's this afternoon in Irish time, Professor Penny Sparke from Kingston University. So I'm going to take over. Please, Penny, who's going to chair. Thank you.
I will. Let's Saoirse leave us. Hi, well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back if you've attended any of the previous 3 sessions of this webinar, and welcome for the first time if you've just joined. So great to have you all here. Just before I start, I'm very close to the subject of this event. I was involved in an advisory capacity in Saoirse's work over recent years on rural electrification and the kitchen in Ireland, and in her preparation of a fantastic exhibition, Kitchen Power, at the National Museum of Ireland, at the Country Centre in Mayo. I think the main message that emerged from this fascinating project is just how rich the subject of the modern kitchen is. It touches on so many different themes and topics, as well as on a wide range of academic disciplines. And this webinar develops Saoirse's subject even further by positioning it in a global context and beginning to see what is the same, what is the different across the world, and most importantly, of course, why. It's a huge subject and has the potential to keep on going for some time to come, especially now we've all got used to meeting with each other online, which allows us to come together from all over the world. So this is the last session of the 2-day webinar, focused on women and education in Canada and Spain. We're extremely fortunate to have speakers from both those countries with us here today. They're going to give us relatively short presentations, roughly 20 minutes each, about the topic as it manifests in their own contexts. The structure of the session will be that the speakers will present, and after that there'll be some time for questions, which I will pick up and address to the speakers on your behalf. And you can use the question and answer facility that's on your screen and start putting questions in as you're listening if you'd like to, or else put them in after the talks. Okay, without more ado, let's go on to the talks. First of all, Professor Ruth Sandwell is from the University of Toronto. Her research interests are in Canadian history, especially in relation to education, rural society, and the social history of energy. She has published widely in her field and is the author of several works exploring the history of energy and everyday life in 19th and 20th century Canada, including being a co-editor of In a New Light, Histories of Wind and Energy, which is due for publication next year, and Powering Up Canada, Essays on the History of Heat, Light and Work from 1600, published in 2016. The title of her talk today is Canadian Kitchen Power, Re-Educating Women for the New Energy Regime, 1890 to 1940. The topic derives from a larger ongoing research project, which I'm sure she'll tell us about. So Ruth, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation, Saoirse. This is a really lovely event. Now I'm hoping you can see my my screen here. Okay, so without further ado, energy is in the news these days, reflecting concerns around the world about energy security, rising energy prices, and increasing anxiety about climate change. Canadians are among those around the world becoming ever more conscious of the ways in which their lives are deeply intertwined with the energy systems that provide them with food, water, light, heat, coolness, shelter, medical services, communications, transportation, entertainment, waste disposal, as well as a world of goods. If some are thinking about energy in the present and worrying about its future, historians are changing the way that they think about energy in the past. My talk today is part of the larger research project that Penny just mentioned, Heat, Light and Work in Canadian Homes, A Social History of Energy, where I turn an energy lens to the household, examining the dramatic changes in day-to-day life that accompanied the country's shift in energy use from a reliance on the solar energy regime of wood, wind, water, and muscle power to the modern or mineral or industrial energy regime of coal, oil, gas, and electricity. Today, I'm going to focus in on one aspect of Canada's great energy transformation, the remarkable public re-education campaign directed at Canadian homemakers. For from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th, homemakers became the targets of an unprecedented, sustained, and multifaceted educational campaign directed at changing their energy-related behaviors in the home. For the first time, I'm claiming in recorded history, the ways that women cooked, cleaned, lighted, and heated their homes became the subject of considerable interest across the nation and beyond. An alliance of professional women, advertisers in the electrical industry, of many levels of government, of manufacturers and mass circulation media, and a range of reformers interested in improving women's lives actively participated in a movement that in retrospect looks like one of the largest purpose-driven education campaigns of all time. My talk today explores the nature and extent of this remarkable campaign through focusing in just on one of the biggest re-educators, the electric utility companies. I will conclude by providing evidence that this re-education project achieved only very limited success in the first two generations that women were exposed to it. While electric lighting was rapidly welcomed into Canadian homes, the majority of women remained largely skeptical about most other uses of electricity. And I'd like to begin by just quickly showing you where I'm talking about. Canada is big, and as a northern country largely unprotected by warm ocean currents, it is both cold and dark a lot of the time. Factors that made Canadians very large consumers of electricity compared to Britain, which indeed they still are. While once electricity became available, only a very small percentage of homes purchased their own, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here, purchased their own electrical generators in the 20th century. Most rural homes remained entirely without electricity until the 1950s, where central station electricity became available. Electricity from massive hydroelectric projects dominated the electricity market in Canada, providing 98% of electricity by 1950, of all Canadian electricity by 1950, and Canada remains the third largest producer of hydroelectricity in the world, with our very small population of 37 million. The utility industry, including such corporations as Ontario Hydro, British Columbia Electric, and Manitoba Hydro, were a significant voice in the energy re-education of women. While the first electrical power stations were small by today's standards, they represented unprecedented investments of capital and labor. The network system delivered a new and mysterious kind of power through a highly complex system. Through a highly complex system. While household consumption of electricity has always been dwarfed by industrial consumption, relatively small household consumers were nevertheless vitally important to the electrical industry. This is because of the nature of electricity itself. As Harold Platt has, as he put it, unlike any previous method of supplying light or power, generating electricity involved a highly interdependent and integrated system, including prime movers, dynamos, regulators, measuring and safety devices, distribution wires, and appliances, all working in instant harmony. Because electrical current needs to keep moving and cannot really be stored, household consumers played a key role in balancing the electrical load, consuming the energy in the off-peak times when it was not needed for commerce or industry. A sales manager, J.A. Halls, explained to his salesman in the Victoria Heat and Light Department in July 1915, while electric stoves represented the biggest potential for increasing electrical consumption in the home, all electrical appliances, no matter how little electricity they required, were important to the network. From the vantage point of the load endeavor, it was well worth the time and effort of persuading women to purchase and use, as J.A. Halls put it, various small appliances such as toasters, percolators, a disc stove, etc., all of which may be operated from the present lighting wires and meter at practically no extra cost to the company and at a minimum of expense to the consumer, and the use of which appliances will be mostly off-peak. By the time households, unquote, by the time households began to use electricity, most of the infrastructure costs necessary to meet the needs of industry, for which they had basically been created, those needs had already, that infrastructure had already been invested. Servicing households, therefore, was the profit icing on the economic cake. By the 1940s, farms and households were consuming only 10% of the kilowatt hours of utility companies across the country, but they were providing 27% of the utility company's revenue. In other words, companies realized that profits could be increased simply by persuading more women to consume more electricity. By the early years of the 20th century, therefore, and in response to lower than expected take-up of electrical service stations, many hydroelectric companies developed aggressive advertising campaigns that sought to educate women about the benefits of this new source of energy. Most hydro companies, Canadians refer for obvious reasons to electricity companies as hydro companies, most of them opened their own appliance showrooms. And here's one in Hamilton, Ontario on this slide. They not only advertised aggressively in newspapers and magazines, but they had their own monthly newspapers, typically created by their home service departments. Recipes, writing competitions about the benefit of modern home, and advertisements for upcoming cooking classes appeared beside practical articles like why a refrigerator or dinner cooked itself. Good wiring for easy living. And in rural areas, articles like boosting egg production and 10 uses for electricity on the farm. Other articles championed the health and well-being that would naturally follow with increased electrical consumption. Summer showers chase fatigue. Optometrists talk about home lighting, and electricity will lighten your wash day work. Others, like, does mother do the pumping on your farm? And Poor Mummy had a somewhat darker message directed at those women who stubbornly continued to, quote, put up with a lot of needless bother and inconvenience, unquote, from an old-fashioned way of working in the home, when everyone knew that, quote, cool, calm, and collected modern girls don't go in for red faces. But it was a hard sell for the first decades. Glittering showrooms with persuasive salesmen were not enough to convince most homemakers to buy. Hydro executives soon realized that electricity would only gain footing in the home if its role is made meaningful and unthreatening to the household economy of values, if it were, in Graham Gooday's words, domesticated. The utility companies worked actively and imaginatively, therefore, to familiarize women with the new appliances and the unfamiliar energies that powered them. Key to their efforts were the ladies of the Home Service Department, who not only wrote the monthly newsletters, but worked actively as well as demonstrators. Many of these were graduates of the domestic science and home economics programs that had started up at Canadian universities from 1910 on. The role of these demonstrators, as they were called, was to educate women to take full advantage of electricity by coaching them through a variety of educational programs and displays, including weekly cooking lessons, not only in the company demonstration model kitchens, such as the one that opened at BC Hydro's offices in Granville Street in 1937, but in other locations. Ontario Hydro demonstrators ran booths at the Kitchen Theatre and the Women's Division of the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto, and at a variety of department stores and even movie theatres across the country. Some utility companies offered a free modern kitchen planning service as well, and even offered educational home visits from a home economist with the purchase of a new stove. Utility companies also sent demonstrators along with samples of their new appliances not only to civic but to agricultural fairs. Traveling exhibitions of modern model kitchens journeyed through the provinces across Canada by truck and by train, championing the benefits of electrification for those throughout rural and more remote areas, demonstrating often in open air shows how, for example, engines could even do double duty, powering the washing machine and the butter churn. One of the first and perhaps the most famous of these traveling shows was the Ontario Hydro Beck's Power Circus. For 2 years, and this is a quote from Keith Jenkins about about Ontario Hydro. For 2 years, covered wagons loaded with every electrical appliance then available for the house or barn toured the province, stopping at farms and agricultural fairs to demonstrate electrical powered equipment at work. Other provinces followed suit. In 1936, Calgary Power hired five home economists to visit rural homes to provide evaluations of home lighting facilities, as well as participating in civic parades on public utilities, floats festooned with various appliances. The amounts of money and attention given to each to such education propaganda campaigns confirms utility and appliance companies' conviction that they could influence people's relation to electricity by increasing its appeal and comprehensibility by carefully showing women the benefits of a modern, clean, and labor-saving form of power. As the Calgary example suggests, utility companies also worked in collaboration with other groups, drawing particularly on the expertise of new women professionals to do so. They worked as well with both agricultural and women's reform organizations, seeking to improve women's lives by reducing their drudgery in the first decades of the 20th century, and I've written about those in more detail elsewhere. Working closely with local advertisers, utility companies also sponsored a variety of radio programs from the late 1930s, using the new medium to instruct women about the benefits of electricity, including the popular Time to Chat series with the byline. And I'll read this. I'll try to do my announcer voice. I just read the transcript. This is Anne Allen, your hydro homemaker, reminding you that you get more out of life, underlined in the transcript, when you get the most out of electricity. Unquote. By the late 1940s, electrical companies were also making their own films, like BC Electric's Dorothy Dream Kitchen and Manitoba Hydro's Farm Electrification. So, and I'm kind of drawing towards my conclusion here. So what were women's responses? Canadians quickly adopted electricity, with almost half of Canadian homes having electricity in their homes by 1921, whereas in Britain, for example, only 6% of households had electricity by 1919. But as this graph shows, rates of electrification varied greatly across the country. This very complicated graph here, the dark blue background here is the Canadian average rates of electrification, home electrification, and then the various lines are the different provinces. So you can see that there's tremendous variation in the percentage of households having electricity in their home. And this slide, it explains why Canada's substantial rural and farm populations were largely excluded from electric power due to low population densities, a defining characteristic of an industry made profitable by economies of scale. The more, the better, as far as the electrical companies were concerned. As late as 1941, half of all Canadians were still cooking with wood, and a third of all households were still relying on kerosene, or I think British people call it paraffin, for their lighting. So there's a little bit of a paradox here. There's very high rates of electrification in urban households and very low rates in the countryside, in rural areas. So, but even in urban areas where rates of urban household electrification were very high, really after the 1920s, consumption levels in cities as well as towns and villages across Canada fell far short of triumphalist dreams. And I was able to get hold of some national level rates of consumption for each of the provinces across the country. And average consumption rates for the country as a whole indicate that it was only by 1951 that Canadians' average electrical consumption per month was around 200 kilowatts per hour, enough to run electric lights and small appliances, but certainly not an electric stove. To the constant frustration of the interested companies, many people, as the statistics suggest, continued to use electricity for lighting only. Typically, only 4 light bulbs in the ceiling of the main floor rooms. And this is despite the barrage of the encouragement and educational materials directing women how and why they should be using more electricity in their homes and for a much broader range of purposes. It was not until well after the Second World War that energy use in the home witnessed rapid and dramatic growth. What explains the resistance of Canadian women to fully embrace, as it were, electricity? As I've argued elsewhere, while many Canadians were glad to install electric lighting in their homes, using it for other purposes simply did not seem worth the cost. In addition, early networks often worked poorly and erratically, and in ways that frustrated and mystified and indeed often frightened consumers. Even more important, women already had ways of effectively meeting their energy needs, ones that had worked well within the material and cultural patterns of their everyday lives, in ways that drew on women's considerable skills and their knowledge, and in ways that they could both afford and understand. All of these factors meant that there was often a poor fit between the household's daily energy needs with electricity and the ability of the electricity grid to meet them. As a result, women responded slowly and cautiously to the new energies that they were being asked to welcome into their homes. This paper has stopped short of exploring how homemakers eventually found ways to incorporate electricity as a benign and even helpful force in their homes, a topic that Anna will be talking about. But I would like to end with the suggestion that the late and abrupt transition to the new energy regime in the 1950s in Canada needs to be understood within the broader context of women's pre-existing energy practices and preferences, and not only in the terms set by those seeking to re-educate them. Thank you very much.
Sorry, not hearing me. I'm just saying you need to imagine that the applause that you're getting now. Unfortunately, you can't hear it. Fascinating talk, thank you, and it sets up very much what we wanted to sort of establish for the next talk. And so we'll take questions after the two papers have been given. So if I could turn to Anna now. I'm going to introduce Ana María Fernández García, who's an art historian and currently the director of the Art History Department at the University of Oviedo. Her doctorate was on the subject of the artistic relationship between Spain and Argentina, 1880 to 1930. She has managed several European and Spanish research projects, as well as being the director of the online journal Res Mobilis, which focuses on decorative arts and design. And Anna's talk today is Spanish Kitchen, Rural and Urban Evolution since 1900, but with an emphasis, I believe, on the period after 1945. Anna, over to you.
Thank you. In the first instance, there is an architectural design, the house and the distribution of the kitchen within it, a design of objects, furniture and other types of equipment, domestic appliances, coal and gas stoves, washing machines, etc. Decoration, of course, with textiles, chairs, tables, etc. And basically a family unit with social class, economic status, and cultural background conditions. I would like to add that although almost all the spaces in the home have traditionally been linked to women, kitchen was the territory par excellence, even when in traditional society, and in Spain that rural or pseudo-rural society remained until the 60s. The kitchen brought together family life because it was the focus of heat and food production in the home. First of all, I want to delimit the chronological scope of my speech, which will be focused on the analysis of Spanish kitchens since the Civil War, which ended in 1939, and which marked the beginning of the dictatorship of General Franco and the isolation of the European political scene during years. In the recent history of Spain, three major periods can be distinguished: the isolated and purposeful years, from 1939 to 1959, the last period of the dictatorship, from 1960 to 1975, led by technocratic Opus Dei ministers who began an opening up of the regime, industrialization, the beginning of mass tourism, and an improvement in living conditions for the Spanish people, and later the subsequent democratic period after the General Franco death, with a political system of parliamentary monarchy and within the European Union. After the war, with the country devastated by conflict and isolated because the rest of the world was fighting in another bigger war, the country's effort was initially the reconstruction, not only of official buildings but also of houses, because one of the most pressing problems of the post-war period was the construction of homes, emergency housing in which architects are more concerned with the appearance of the exteriors and the lower construction cost than with the interior configuration. At that time, the kitchen, neither in layout or in equipment, was not different from the pre-war one. Coal stoves, manual utensils, basic wooden furniture, etc. In the photographs here, we can see few differences in the equipment of the kitchen from the 1915 and another from the 1955. Its coal stove, its rudimentary utensils, the absence of water supply, no evidence of any kind of domestic technology, and more shelves than not cupboards. Water supply was introduced in the construction of the working class neighborhoods at the end of the 50s, which was a great novelty for people who came from the countryside, used to accumulating water in buckets and tanks. Only then could water supply works be carried out in the cities, while in the rural home the forced coming and goings to fountains were maintained until the 60s. In these urban neighborhoods, the distribution of interior space was really one that made the kitchen a place for sociability, continuing with the models of use of space in the towns and achieving a clear economy of space. Post-war kitchen objects were practically the same as those used in the early 20th century. Similar coal stoves, with the difference of the materials in addition to the improvement of the manufacturing processes and the great interior surface of the cooking. Identical tools for the preparation of the pig slaughter, the churn, the butter, or to keep the food fresh before the generalization of the refrigerator in Spanish homes. The fridge appears in the 50s only in the urban context, with that kind of design that you can see in the screen, inspired in American models. Concerning furniture, little by little the shelves will disappear and the melamine storage furniture will arrive. As in the rest of Europe after the war, the washing machine became an indispensable element of any home. It became part of the kitchen with an aesthetic integrated with the rest of the furniture and electrical appliances, and occasionally in the bathroom or in the terrace. Regardless of this place in the home, the discovery of an appliance capable of washing laundry and even drying it a few years later not only facilitated the task of the housewife, but also had other social and cultural implications. The first and most obvious is that the washing machine put an end to the traditional female sociability in the rural world and in the popular classes, who meet in the louder space, a place to exchange opinions, to find out what was happening in their social environment. Traditional laundry practices in fountains and rivers remained in Spain until the 70s, especially in the village. Female sociability around laundry also implies a solidarity between the women who help each other to pat the blankets, to turn the sheets green, or to drain the heavy pieces of linen. For many women, those moments were the only minutes of the day in which they left the daily routine that was enclosed within the walls of their home. Note in these pictures the coexistence of traditional laundry practices with modern clothes of two generations, all laundry activities with new fashion tendencies. Both in the countryside and in the city, the kitchen epitomized the epic of a state that was rebuilt itself from its ashes, that was rebuilding itself from its wounds. In those years, the kitchen continued to be the pole of the family sociability, with the coal stove as the altar for cooking and the heat around which people ate, talked, sewed, and shared their life. Notice in this picture how the young man in the photo takes the opportunity to drink straight from the red wine bottle while his parents are concentrated in the photographer. The second period of the Spanish contemporary history coincides with the successive technocratic governments of the dictatorship, the arrival of thousands of tourists, the beginning of imports from the rest of the continent and United States, and with the exodus from the countryside to the cities. In this stage of expansion of new neighborhoods, the interior design of the kitchen changes radically as the technology of domestic appliance, modular furniture in the kitchen, design elements, etc. are introduced. It is therefore not surprising that the woman in this image is so proud of the very modern kitchen she was achieved. In that transition from one country to another, from a country in black and white to another that was returning to color, it was betting on modernity. There was many actors in the interior design of the kitchen. Firstly, the architects proposed, both in the working class dwelling and in the bourgeois one, a separate kitchen from the rest of the household units. Thus, the old concept of the kitchen as a meeting place was lost to reserve its true role as a space for production and storage of food. We have to talk also about the use of modular furniture adapted to the different needs and dimensions of the kitchen. Here we have another picture about it. There was the triumph of the gas cooker that was already manufactured by the appropriate measure to be integrated into modular sets. Unprecedented use of technology at home, the kitchen was filled with electrical appliances that help to carry out housework at the time when women were incorporated into the labor market and university studies, until then practically closed for women. In this sense, a superficial analysis of the advertising exemplifies how the products were aimed at those women who are not only the angels of the home, the Franco rhetoric, but also voracious consumers of devices that can improve their quality of life. They are shown in these images happy, elegant, and satisfied by the possession of certain objects that a few decades ago seemed like elements of a science fiction story. With these new consumption patterns, specialized stores, local and national trade fairs dedicated to showing and selling the new home technology proliferated. We can't forget the rise of national design, especially in Barcelona and Madrid, with designers and products that have been milestones of Spanish creation and that are now in museums, like this Beta or this user. What happened in Spanish design after Franco's death? Broadly speaking, it was homogenized with respect to the rest of Western temporal patterns and rhythms. The vagueness in technology leveled off with the rest of the European continent. The family was gradually became a more democratic place where decisions are taken in a shared way, and the hierarchy of the patriarchal structure is fortunately weakening. The home, which for centuries has been the only form of fulfillment for women, and also the prison, was come to play a totally different role in female life. In addition, the family units are smaller, and perhaps that is why the idea of doing housework all together is emphasizing, as IKEA advertising is so often exploded. There are many challenges for historians of that period, such as analyzing if the kitchens of immigrants respond to the same consumption patterns as the rest of society. Is the kitchens as net as operating rooms are common in all sectors of Spain, or if there are picturesque models for second homes like a sort of rural revival. It could also be necessary to analyze the weight of the cooking programs on TV, where the furniture organized in Ireland has imposed. The ovens are placed at an ergonomic height, and the organization of the space runs a machine à cuisiner, paraphrasing Le Corbusier. As always, what is clear is that the kitchen is still a place where are summarized many ways to connect with the rest of the family, to cook and to live. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am happy to answer any question that you may have.
Thank you, Anna, very, very much indeed. That was very, very nice, and the images were wonderful, giving us that sense of change over that period of time. Okay, thank you both speakers. I think you've introduced a wide body of material and a number of quite big questions, I think, that relate across the two papers. So we'll go to see what questions we have. There's one already in which I shall read out, and this is from Eleanor Peters. It's addressed to you, Ruth, and Eleanor says, "Thank you, Ruth, for your interesting talk. I'm fascinated by the mediating role which demonstrators played between consumers and the industry. I was wondering if there is anything distinctive about the demonstrators and female electrical advisors who worked in Canada in this period, compared to the home economists who worked for the heating and lighting companies in North America at the same time. Does your research indicate that they were trained similarly?" Okay, Ruth, we've got a long question. Did you did you get that?
Yes. Yeah. So the Canadian, so yes, that's an interesting question. And I'll just add that one of the nice things about this symposium is that it's so international and so showing so many international connections. And, of course, there were differences. For the demonstrators, the Canadian home economics model and the university training and degrees that women were able to get at Canadian universities were pretty explicitly modeled on the American ones. Canadians also would look more to Britain, less to Europe, but more to Britain as well. So, for example, the first book that I read was Anne Clendining's book on the demonstrators in Britain, especially in the gas industry. and from her, I learned about the demonstrators and went to look at their role in Canada. And it seemed that the role was very, very similar. They had, there's such an interesting gender element to all of this. Joy Parr has also written about the way that the men who were the salesmen really didn't meet women's needs. Women were, and the same actually is true of design, which is designers, which is a different question. But no, there was a huge overlap. Women really did play, as you said, this mediating role between the needs or what the industry had to offer and what women wanted from an electrical service. So, for example, I interviewed one of the demonstrators at BC Electric, and she was, explained to me how her job changed between 1945, when she was first hired, and the 1970s. But every time that somebody bought an electric stove at BC Electric, her job was to go and spend an hour with them in their kitchen baking a cake and on the new electric stove. And I asked her, well, what could go wrong? She said, well, for example, most Canadian women were making a shift not from a gas stove or a coal stove, but actually from a wood stove. And in a wood stove, you cook by putting whatever you're baking, baked goods, right on the bottom of the oven. So many women were returning their electric stoves or phoning the company and saying, it doesn't work, it just burns everything. So that sort of speaks to this mediating role, between the electrical companies and the men who by and large simply never really used the appliances that they were selling. So a really important thing. I'll just say there has not been enough research done, as in many things to do with the history of electricity and women's history in the home. There's still lots of room for more research, but my research so far has indicated that yes, there was a really large overlap and really direct communication. The women Canadian demonstrators and home economists would go to the American meetings, and they used very explicit examples of curriculum in those early years especially. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. A question from Grace Lees-Maffei. I think this is aimed at either of you or both of you. Let's see it. Following on from comments from the last speaker about national design, I want to ask a question about the whole conference. Firstly, about the significance of the national as a unit of analysis for understanding domesticity and/or electrification, and why this is chosen as an organizing principle. And then secondly, whether the speakers agree with me that a strong case has been made by these largely national studies, with the exception of a paper about Scandinavia, which is a region, not a nation, for comparative studies. Okay, so it's a question then about the role of national as the category that's been chosen as an organizing principle here, and whether it's the right one, I suppose. I think we'll ask both of you that. Shall we start with Anna?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
I thank you very much, Penny. I agree with Grace about her question, because in this case, talk about national or international design depends on the period, the historical period, because for example, in the case of Spain, during the Francoist period, the autarky was completely, especially during 13 years. So all the electrical appliances were produced in the country, not imported from other countries like, I don't know, Great Britain or Germany. Later, of course, when we talk about design, we talk about international design, because our consumption habits are the same in all the countries, and we buy in IKEA, we buy in the same department stores, and everything is the same. And concerning the case of studies, I guess that it's necessary to have a general overview about the design studies, because we have a short studies about Spanish, French, written design, but not a real general history with connections, with links, with influence that maybe we have to organize in the future altogether.
Thank you. Ruth, your view on that same question, if I may.
Yes, no, I agree with Anna. I mean, there are some very, very interesting things that are brought out by looking at the national level, and especially like in this workshop and symposium. But one of those things that's so interesting is the similarities between nations, which of course does raise the question of what is the appropriate category of analysis for looking at all kinds of issues to do with electrification, and design is kind of an obvious one. Canada had quite a large electrical manufacturing or appliance manufacturing industry for a while before it became international. And people, Joy Parr, who I mentioned earlier, has written explicitly about how Canada differed from both Scandinavian countries and the United States, especially until the 1950s. There were more distinctive designs and more things that were distinctly Canadian. But having said that, for me, one of the really interesting questions that electricity raises, and especially network systems of electricity, is about how the network, like the idea that we're all connected through electricity, what that does to our understanding of women in the home. And Anna's paper, I think, did a really nice job of showing, like, what we're seeing is that, yeah, everybody has exactly the same, I mean, not exactly the same, of course, but compared to the way that women used to work in their own kitchens, which had to do, I mean, Canada was so reliant on wood, and a lot of people were chopping their own wood in their own homes, as was the case in Scandinavia as well, you know, long into the 20th century. And that's just a totally different scale of energy use. You know, if I want a new wood stove, if I have the money or no friends who can make one, then I can have one. But if I want to get an electric stove, I've got to have at least 10 of my neighbors using electricity. Or if you live in a city, you have to have a whole neighborhood wired. So there's all kinds of, I think the implications for understanding the relationship between electricity and modernity, and electricity and the modern capitalist world are really worth exploring as well. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that workshops like this sort of start opening the different levels and areas of discussion. So thanks for that great question.
Thank you very much. Okay, one from Molly Claire Gillett. Thank you both! Exclamation mark, much enjoyed. I was interested to hear how electrification impacted women's social lives in the Spanish context. Washing clothes together versus alone with a washing machine, for example. So that's a question obviously for Anna. And then there's a second part of the question, which is for Ruth. Do you see similar shifts in women's social lives in Canada as a result of electrification? So that's for both of you. If Anna could perhaps start the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Molly, for your question. Yes. So the electrification impacted so much in the life of Spanish women, of course, not only in the washing machine, but also in other electrical appliances. But in our case, it was parallel to other important goals in the women history. For example, in this period, the Spanish women are able to work with any kind of permission of her husband or parents. So it was a very important goal in their lives, not only a electrical appliance, but also a social and political goals for them.
Thank you. Ruth, if you'd like to follow through.
Yeah, no, that's another great question. Honestly, I've thought more about that question in relation to fossil fuels, especially gasoline, and how women's mobility with the automobile really transformed their relationships, their neighborhood relationships. But electricity also changed the way that women, in changing the way that women did things, their sort of practices changed the way that they related to other women. In Canada, until the second or third decade of the 20th century, work bees remained, as the work of Kathy Wilson has documented this, remained really important to women's work, that they would get together with their neighbors 2 or 3 times a year, or seasonally, to make sure to work together to do things like, famously, like making maple syrup or quilting bees or things like that. And that remained an important part of rural socialization for women. And that, of course, when everyone has their own sewing machine, that's not so important. But what I've really spent a lot of time thinking about is just the skills erosion that happened with women with electrification. And part of my work has been always asking this question: why did it take women so long to make the shift to electricity, even when it was available? And certainly part of it was women took such pride in doing those things that electricity was replacing. So there's been a lot of talk about that, in the male labor movement and the de-skilling of the skilled artisan. But I think that was a really important factor. Certainly the women that I've talked to, while none of them would say, oh, I was really sorry electricity came, there's a dominant narrative in the stories that I hear, in the memoirs that I have read about electricity making life easier. So that they all agree with. But then there is also a sense of loss, I think I would call it, about people saying, usually talking about their mothers, oh, my mother never got rid of the electric stove. And many, many women in Canada continued using their wood stove even after they got their electric stove. So, and it's because they just felt it didn't do as good a job. And as one mother of a woman I talked to said, like, nobody could understand this wood stove except me. Like, nobody could make as excellent bread in it as I could. And so the wood stove was something that she took pride in. And there are a lot of things like that, like understanding exactly what temperature you could beat eggs at, and trying to understand how refrigeration was going to help anything to do with it. So there are all just this layers and layers of women's expertise and knowledge about what went on in the home that was lost, or I would say undervalued. Like, women experienced it, and I think that's part of their reticence in buying new appliances, because they felt that it was sort of saying you can be replaced by a machine, which of course we have been. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. From Claire O'Mahony, thank you for your very thoughtful presentations. Might you tell us more about the localization of small appliances manufactured in your respective contexts? Did they reflect the multiple linguistic cultures of Spain and Canada? That is, to what extent were Franco slash Anglophone traditions catered to in Canada, or Catalonian, Castilian gastronomic cultures inspired by Anna's orange juicer? So again, both of you, if you could give an answer to that, that would be great.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much for your question, Claire. Yes, well, concerning the Catalonian or Castilian gastronomic culture, in fact, it's the same, because there are not many differences, because it's a Mediterranean cuisine. But this question is very important, because in our country we have some small electrical appliance original, because are connected with our cuisine. Not only in the user, but also in an electric paella. This is a very small appliance to cook paella, and also a frying pan to cook tortilla, that was quite successful in 60s and 70s. Well, it's not the traditional way to cook tortilla or paella, but sometimes it was an idea, of the designers.
Ruth.
There were a few, when I'm thinking, the main linguistic and cultural division in Canada before the Second World War. like across the country, was of course French and English, and there were differences in cuisine, and there were differences in the persistence of wood stoves, where it was even longer, like generally in Quebec, where, and in fact now my daughter's looking to buy a house in Montreal, and just outside Montreal, and there's so many houses that are still have a wood stove as a backup, you know, to the electric system for the most part. So yes, it's there is some differences. There's also differences across the country. There's a very large Asian population in Vancouver, as well as in Toronto. So things like the rice cooker really took off. Electric rice cooker took off much earlier became common in Canada, perhaps more than in other areas. So there's some regional ones. I don't think, it's a great question, but I don't think that it was manifested at the level of the appliance companies. There were quite a few companies. Montreal was and still is one of Canada's leading industrial centers. So there were appliance industries there. And I would have to do more research. The book that's been written, the most significant book on appliance design in Canada by Joy Parr, doesn't spend a lot of time distinguishing along those lines. But in terms of cuisine, there are differences, but not so much in terms of the appliances, which, did, to return to this theme of standardization, moved really quickly to a standard modern idea of what a kitchen was and what it should be.
Thank you very much. Okay, there's no more open questions. I'm going to steal the minute just to have a question myself, if I may, please, to both of you. And it relates to things you both said. I was very struck, Ruth, by your comment about the resistance, really, by women in Canada to what was a very heavy push by the electrical companies, certainly in the early centuries, to get them to shift their thinking. And it seemed as if sounded like quite an exceptional level of resistance to me. But I wondered also whether that was the case in Spain at all, or whether what you described as the technocratic regime of the 60s, which was so embracing, as you say, technologies, took women with them, or whether there was any resistance then or later. So I suppose perhaps, Ruth, if you'd just say a little bit more about that notion of resistance.
Okay, I'll say first of all that I'm unusual, or at least not everyone agrees with me, until I was able to come up with this evidence about the levels of electrical consumption. The overwhelming narrative in Canada is that Canadians were just like in the United States, only not quite so much. Like they were not quite so, moved quite so early or quite so quickly, but then maybe did a post-war period. But because my work is, so the way I look at my work is that I have been uncovering counter narratives that help to explain the quantitative data that I have been able to find and use to explore actually what people on average were doing in their homes, which doesn't conform at all. So from that evidence, I've been trying to say, okay, how can I understand this? What are the, the little hints that people drop, or what are to explain this difference between what they say about how willing they were to take up electricity at the time, for the most part, and what they actually did in their behavior. So, I don't want to say I'm exaggerating the resistance, but I'm like looking at a problem or an issue that hasn't really been identified. So I don't know. I would be interested to see. I mean, Canada was very, like, we know overall from the recent statistical overview of energy transitions, Canada was late, much later than Britain and most of Western Europe and the United States in making a transition from fossil fuels, from the organic energy regime to fossil fuels and electricity. So we know that, and I'm trying to include this narrative of women's behavior in the household into that larger narrative, which also hasn't, until the data came out in 2013, people just thought Canada was really basically just like the United States, but just so
yeah. No, that's a very convincing argument. I'm enjoying it. Anna, any sense of similar things happening?
Yes. In our case, in the case of of Spain, I found some evidence of that kind of resistance of women to the technological appliance. It's possible to find two different situations. On one hand, we find the advertisement message with very aggressive campaigns that the women need that kind of electric appliance in order to improve their life. But on the other hand, we can find women opinions that say, well, it's better to clean the clothes by hand because it's cleaner than the other way. Or, for example, concerning the oven, the traditional oven in front of the electrical one. So it's possible to find that kind of resistance, yes, especially in sisters, yes.
Thank you. That's interesting. Big subject for discussion there, I think. Well, we don't have any more open questions, so I think we're going to pull things to a natural end. It's 4 o'clock, so that's a very well timed. Now, could I just say thank you again to both of the speakers? I think they were both very stimulating talks. I thoroughly enjoyed them. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I think we're going to return to Saoirse to bring events to an end.
Yeah. Thank you, Penny, and thank you, Anna and Ruth, for some fascinating talks, because part of what I wanted to just talk about as we were wrapping up is actually part of the questions that Grace brought up about the significance of the national as a unit of analysis in this case. And one of the reasons from my point of view, as organising this symposium was some of the conversations that I was having with colleagues in other countries about the similar issues, the similar sets of ideas, but with wildly different economic, political, and cultural backgrounds, where people, you know, a lot of us have been looking at issues and looking at people who were dealing with the same issues, but doing so in quite different ways. And it's particularly this sort of tangle of, you know, modernity and modern design. How does it play out in a gendered environment? How does it play out different in the gender roles or different approaches to technology, that they get quite tangled up? And part of the work I've certainly been doing, I think a lot of us have, has been trying to unpick that and work out how is that happening, or what was happening with those ideas and objects and processes and practices as well. Particularly when you're dealing with this whole idea, you know, particularly if you're teaching undergraduates, for example, you know, these ideas about modernism and efficiency and universality being brought around in being discussed in the mid-century, that it's very much that counter narrative of, well, it didn't happen the same way everywhere, and it's to do with specifics of different economies, different political situations, and different national cultures as well, and different ways of, you know, things like knowledge transfer networks, and, you know, the role of women and different things about the emancipation of women, how that was actually playing out. Because over the 8 papers altogether, I've been picking up things about, you know, the influence of things like the traditional layout of kitchens, but also their position in the house, which is something that I hadn't really thought about before. But then things like the role of cultural values, or, you know, there might be religious or what tends to be called family values, but also then how different areas are dealing with consumerism and different levels of consumerism, and the role of the corporation within that as well, whether it's an electrical utility or an appliance manufacturer, or sometimes both. And the role of exhibitions and magazines, and actually that discourse that's going on around all of this topic at the time as well as now. But also then the role of individual actor or groups of actors. So you've got, you know, designers, but also architects, the housewives themselves, but also the home economists as well, and different sorts of experts. So looking at how all of these things actually work in different areas and give you these sort of different permutations and combinations of how you've got different groups are dealing with it. And I guess from my point of view that it's very much part of this idea of coming out of design history, that you might have lots of different groups trying to deal with the same sort of issues, but they might go about it different ways. And you can't necessarily plan, you know, if you're a designer, that you design something, it's going to be used exactly the way you intend it to, that the use and the consumption of that is complex and complicated, and takes some understanding. So yeah. So I basically, just to finish up, I wanted to say thank you to all of our speakers and all of our chairs over the last 2 days. I wanted to thank the National Museum of Ireland, just first of all, for being the partner in staging this the Kitchen Power exhibition, but also partner with NCAD in Dublin for this symposium, and obviously then NCAD as well, and the Design History Society, who we have got the first virtual award grant from the Design History Society for this event. And I particularly as well wanted to thank my old colleagues in Kingston University as well for a very long and productive working relationship with them, and the funding from the AHRC that I had gotten, which funded the original research that I had done on this topic. So I basically wanted to say thank you all. And unfortunately, we can't all, as Jane said yesterday, we can't all go and have a drink together now. And it's probably, I think, Ruth, it's probably lunchtime in Canada, so it might not be such a good idea at the moment. But I just wanted to say that I hope that we would continue these conversations between the speakers, but also between the audience as well, because we've had some fantastic questions in over the 2 days. So, and thank you all.